There are some subtleties with replicating containers in Unreal. Before we discuss those, how do you replicate a property in Unreal? So the first thing you need is to make sure it is a property, and then you set it to be either replicated or replicated using, which will flag it for replication. And replicated using allows you to specify a callback, which is called when it replicates to the client. So here we have our U function, OnRep, replicated int array, and then we can add an optional parameter to it that is previous state, which will tell you the state before replication happened, so you can calculate the differences or deltas. But there's one thing I missed here. You need to go into the get lifetime replicated props and label it for replication. And so here we have this replicated int array, and we add this shared params push to true, so this is new replication. And we say do rep lifetime with params fast, class name, the property that replicates, and the shared params, which is just a struct defining how it replicates. And there's one last thing you need to do to ensure this replicates to the client, at least with push replication, and that is you need to mark it dirty. And so we have a function here that's server modify replicated array, and if it's on the server, we add a value to it and mark it dirty. And this ensures that the system can replicate it down to the client. So that's a quick review of how replication works in Unreal. In this file, I've created numerous experiments to explore the different caveats of replicating with containers. So the first, we'll just see how replicating the container works. So here we have a TArray of just ints. So this is a pretty simple case of replication. So let's test replication with containers. Make sure for Pi, you have set net mode to place client, which will spin up a dedicated server and a client, and then we can run Pi. And so the first command is to just test replicating the array. So if I type command.container rep test and then replicate int array, if I were to execute this command now, it would actually run the command on the client. And what we want is to execute this on the server so that it replicates down to the client. And so there's a prefix you can put, which is server exec. And this will tell Unreal to send the command to the server, the dedicated server, instead of the client. So if I run the command, we will trip a breakpoint. And this is server modify replicated array. So we check to really have the authority, which in this case means we're the server because we're doing place client. And so we'll just add a value to the end of the array, which is the current num. And so the replicate array, we add the value, we mark it dirty. And so you can see from the context strings below that we are executing on the dedicated server right now. So I mark it dirty, and then I will continue, and we hit a breakpoint in this OnRep, which is our OnRep for the property. And so if you look down here, we have plain editor context is client 1, so we know that now we're on the client, and we have this OnRep call. And if we inspect our previous state, it is empty. And if we inspect the replicated int array, we can see that it now has a value of 0 inside of it. And so that is how basic replication works. I'll add a few more. And we can see that the replicated array on the server, we're adding to it. And the OnRep shows that there's now 3 entries, and the previous state only had 2 entries. And so that's basic array replication. Things get a little more complicated when we introduce structs into the matter. And so I have created this struct called custom replicated struct for containers. If I go to the definition, we can take a look at it. So I have some pop quiz questions about this. Which of these properties will replicate? So we have a raw ustruct, a name matching the prefix, generate body, and then we have a uProperty, which is not marked up at all. We have a uProperty, which is flagged as not replicated, and then we have a plain old int, which is not a uProperty at all. And so the question is, which of these do you think will replicate? Do you think this will replicate? Do you think this will replicate? Do you think this will replicate? The answers are, this one will replicate. A raw uProperty in a struct that is in a context where it's replicated will replicate the raw uProperty. The not replicated one, obviously, is not going to replicate. This is how you flag properties you don't want to replicate if you had a rather large struct. And the last one is the int, which is not a uProperty. So will this one replicate? It will not. So you might think maybe it's just doing some mem copies or something, but it does not appear to be the case. Only the reflected properties get replicated for structs. And so the struct also has some other helpful information. We have increment values, so we can test if we change the struct inside of an array, will it replicate? And we have a message that lets us debug the struct with a context message like server or client, and it prints out the first property, rep, the not rep property, which is this one here, and the not property, which is the last one. So we can run an experiment to test the replication. And so if we look back at our arrays of structs. It's a property. It's replicated using this OnRep. So it has an OnRep function that gets called when something is replicated. It is just an array of this struct. And in the lifetime properties, we have set it to be replicated. Now I've duplicated this struct. We've got the push replication version and the old replication version. The only difference is that we have to mark this one dirty. This one just automatically replicates at a performance cost. And so if we look at the lifetime replicate properties, you can see that for the push replication, we had to give it the shared params, which are these push params. And for the old style replication, we just do rep lifetime. And so we have some functions to test, and we're going to test what happens if we add to the struct array. Will it do an onRep? What happens if we increment all the values in the array? Will it onRep then? What happens if we mod a middle value in a struct and we're not adding anything to it? Will it replicate then? And we have some predictive array modifications where we modify it on the client before the server, doing client-side prediction, and determine will the onRep function be called then. And so for the first test, we'll do command.containerRep test, and we'll add a struct entry. Now again, we want this to execute on the server so that it'll replicate down to the client. So we'll add the prefix server exec, and I will run that. And we hit a breakpoint for the add struct to array. So if we're on the server, then in place something at the end of the push replication array, mark it dirty so that it replicates, and then also for the old replication, we'll do the same thing and place it at the end of it. But because it's old replication, we don't have to mark it dirty. So if I continue, you'll see that we had an onRep called for the push replication, which is expected. We added an entry to the array, so you would expect that it would call an onRep because the array size changed. And so we can look at the push replication. It now has one member, and that member has all zeros because we didn't increment any of the values. And so we just log that to the log. Client onRep has value 000. And if we continue, we also get an onRep for the old style replication. The previous one was the push style replication. And if we continue over that, we see that also on the client, it has a value 000. And so if I add another one to the array, we'll get another onRep. So I ran the console command, and we just placed two more things on the server into the array. And so the client still only has one. Let's see if we hit the onRep. We do. So we hit the onRep for the push replication, and the client array now has two. So the replication was successful. Everything is 0. So I'll run that one more time so we can have 3 entries into the struct. So we can have 3 entries into the array. Server adds them, dedicated server, and we get our onReps. Now let's ask another question. If I were to modify every value in the array, do you think the onRep would be called? Or do we have to add to or remove from the array for the onRep to be called? We have a command, container rep test, and that is to modify all the structs, so we're going to increment all of them. So again, we want to do that on the server, so I'm going to prefix that with server exec, if I spell it correctly. So now we can see on the server, we are going to go over our entire array, so a for loop of each, where there's zeros in every entry. We're going to increment the values and log the message. And so I'll step over these. We'll do the same thing for the other old replication. And if we look at the log, we can see that the server push has values of 1 for every entry now, and the server not push also has values for every entry now. And so again, if you think about the struct, which of these will replicate, and so if we continue, we should see onReps. And so we got the onRep on the client. Step over that. You can see here that the client onRep for push replication has a value of 1 in the rep spot, 0 in the not replicated spot, and 0 in the just plain old property. If we continue, we also get the onRep for the old style replication with the same deal. We have 1 in the rep spots, 0 in the not rep spots, and 0 in the non-property. What that means is when an array's contents change, you get an onRep called. So what happens if you change a value in the middle of the array? Will you get an onRep there, or does it have to be a whole array modification? And so we have another command, which is to modify a middle struct. And again, we want that on the server, so server exec. And my question to you is, do you think you'll get an onRep if you only modify one of the 3 entries, or do you need to make data changes to all of them to get an onRep? So we'll run this. We will find a middle index with some quick math, which is index 1, and since we have 3 entries, we're going to modify this middle index at 1. Step over that, And if we check the log, we can see that the server push middle value is now has 2s for everything, and the server not push now has 2s for everything also. Let's see if we get an OnRep. It looks like we have got an OnRep. If I step over this, we log the messages. And the client state of the array is there is still 3 entries. The first entry is still at 1, the last is still at 1, but the middle entry is replicated at 2. And again, these other properties, they never replicate because of their setup. And we'll continue just to see the old style of replication. Step over that. And again, the old style also works. The middle entry is the only one that got modified. And so array replication works in that you can modify a middle array element and it will cause an OnRep despite there only being a change in the middle entry. And so you can modify the size of array, add or remove. You can modify the contents of an internal indice, and it all causes OnReps. So the last question is, what happens if you predictively modify the array before the server modifies it? And so we have this predict array modify. We will continue, and I'll type command.containerRepTest predictive array modify. Now the thing about this is we want this to run on the client, and internal to this test, it's going to call it on the server. So I'm going to actually not do server exec here. I'm going to just do the regular command to have it run on the client. And we can see we tripped a breakpoint and predictive array modify. If we look at our debug context string, we are in client 1. And so we get the middle index again, which is 1, make sure the index is valid. And for the middle index, we're going to increment the properties. We mark it dirty, which is not really doing anything for us on the client, but when we run this on the server, it'll tell the server to replicate. And so for the old style, we increment the values there too. And so if we look at the client's arrays, we can see that the middle value has an int property of 3. So it went from 2 to 3. And the same thing for the old style. Now, if we are the client, so we don't have authority, and because we launched as play as client, that's not being the authority means we are the client. We run this execute console command, which is, this has the server exec in it, so it means run this on the server, not the client, and do the command containerRepTest predictive array modify. Now it's important to note this is only really going to work in the editor. Don't try to use RPCs this way, but so we're going to do server exec command continue. Now we can see that the predictive array modify is executing on the server. So this has happened second. The client modified it first. If we look at the server's contents, it still has a 2 in it for both of these arrays. And so go ahead and modify it. We mark it dirty, telling the server, hey, the client needs to know this. And we do the same thing for old replication. And since this is not the client, we skip over that last bit. So now my question for you is, do you think the OnRep will be called? Will it call the OnRep despite the value already being 3 on the client? So let's continue to find out. And I triggered no OnRep at all. So if you do client-side prediction by default, if the value is the same as what the server replicated to you, then you don't call your OnRep functions. So in this way, you can do client-side predictive behavior. But let's say you actually had a scenario where sometimes that worked and sometimes you just needed to let the client know that the server had reprocessed it. What you can do is go up to your lifetime replicated props, and there's a rep condition notify. And so I will just do it for the new style replication. It's a different syntax, but it is also possible for old style. Well, I'm not going to type it, but here's an old example from some ability system code where it says do rep lifetime condition notify health set condition none, let rep notify always. So that's how it would look in the old style. But anyways, we'll set it rep notify always. Okay, now I have set it to rep notify always. I have rebooted the editor. We'll add some structs. And let's do the predictive array modify. So now we are on the client. The arrays have all zeros on the client. Now the array middle indices have 1s. And so if I continue, we are now executing it on the server second. And the server is now updating the middle value from 0 to 1. And so if I continue, I should hit an OnRep. So now we see we hit the OnRep push replication for the client. And the array value is still 1. So it did not change. And so that's what the rep notify condition does. We'll explore containers more in detail in further videos.